Morning. This is Rajeshkumar. Today we are going to analyze one problem question on homicide in under the criminal law. The video content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. Kindly go through this slide completely. Let's start with the problem question. Annie is married to Bert. Their relationship is volatile, and Bert can be aggressive and even violent when he has been drinking alcohol. One evening, Annie and Bert are out to dinner with Bert's colleagues. Bert is drinking heavily. Bert begins mocking Annie in front of his colleagues and keeps calling her a useless little wifey. Later that evening, he makes advances to a female colleague in front of Annie, and Annie storms out of the restaurant and goes for a walk. Annie returned home later that night to find Bert waiting for her. Bert immediately calls her a loser for leaving the restaurant. When Annie tries to raise the issue of Bert's advances towards his female colleague in the restaurant, Bert bursts out laughing and says, "There is a plenty of women you don't even know about." Outraged Annie grabs the bottle of wine and throws it directly at Bert. Bert moves quickly to avoid being hit by the wine bottle and falls down, hitting his head on the corner of the table. Bert is unconscious and bleeding. Annie stands over him and shouts, "Finally, you suffer too. You got what you deserve," and leaves the house. The neighbors hears the commotion and call for an ambulance. The ambulance take hours to arrive, and Bert dies of the injuries he sustained in the fall. We have to discuss Annie's liability for the death of Bert. Let's start analyzing the problem. Question: the analysis of Annie's liability for the death of Bert. To establish Annie's liability for murder, the prosecution must prove that Bert was a human being killed under the king's peace, that Annie caused his death, and that she acted with the requisite mens rea. The actus rea is satisfied as Bert, a human being, died as a result of the head injury sustained when Annie throws the wine bottle at him. The causation analysis involves both the factual and legal causation. The factual causation is satisfied under the but-for test in R versus White case in 1910, as Bert would not have died but for Annie's action. The legal causation requires Annie's act to be significant contributing factor to Bert's death, where you can find the details on R versus Fisher case in 1991. Although the ambulance delay was a factor, it does not break the chain of causation, as medical negligence must be so independent and so potent that the defendant's act is rendered insignificant. Here, Annie's act of throwing the bottle directly at Bert and causing him to fall was a substantial and operative cause of the death. Annie's mens rea for murder could be established if she intended to kill or cause a grievous bodily harm. Under R versus Moran case in 1985, an intention to cause a serious harm suffices. The Annie's deliberate act of throwing the bottle, coupled with her statement, "Finally you suffer too," suggests she at least intended to cause the grievous bodily harm. If there is doubt about direct intention, the indirect intention under Orus's ruling case in 1999 may apply if Annie foresaw the serious harm as a virtual certainty of her action. To analyze Annie's liability for Bert's death, we must consider the legal principles of the homicide, focusing on murder, voluntary manslaughter, and potential defenses. The actus reus of the homicide involves an unlawful killing of a human being. Annie's act of throwing the wine bottle, which directly led to a bird's fall and subsequent death, satisfy the actus reus as her actions initiated a chain of causation. The key issue is whether Annie's act was a factual and a legal cause of Bird's death. Applying the birth for test from R versus White in 1910, birth death would not have occurred but for Annie's action. However, for legal causation, we must assess whether there was an novus actus intervenus, the intervening act that broke the chain of causation, such as the delay in medical attention. According to R versus Cheshire case in 1999 1991, the medical negligence does not typically break the chain unless it is so independent and potent as to render the original act insignificant, which is unlikely in this case. Partial differences in the loss of control. If murder is established, Annie could argue the partial differences of loss of control under the section 44 and 55 of the Criminals and Justice Act 2009, the CJA 2009, to reduce the liability to the manslaughter. The first one is loss of control. The section 54(1)(a) requires evidence that Anne is the lost control. A delayed reaction does not preclude this defense, as held in R versus Alvalia in 1992 case, where a cumulative effect of abuse led to a loss of control after a delay. The Anne is outraged upon learning of Bert's infidelity, and his mockery may constitute such a reaction, even though it was not immediate. The second one is the qualifying trigger. Section 54(1)(b) requires a qualifying trigger, which can include a fear of serious violence under the Section 55(3), things said or done under the Section 55(4), or a combination of both under the Section 55(5). Annie could argue that Bird's belittling remarks, mockery, and admission of infidelity constitute a trigger, while the Section 55(6)(c) excludes the sexual infidelity as a sole trigger. R versus Clinton case in 2012 allows it to be considered if it forms the part of a broader context of provoking acts. A bird's cumulative verbal abuse and infidelity may suffice as a qualifying trigger. Turning to mens rea, a murder requires an intention to kill or causing the bodily harm, as in R versus Vickers case in 1957. In other words, Annie's primary intention appears to have been to express the anger, not to kill birds. However, her actions might indicate a recklessness if she foresaw the risk of serious harm. If the mens rea for murder is not established, then the voluntary manslaughter may be considered if mitigating the circumstances apply. The defenses of loss of control under the Section 54(5) of the CJA Act 2009 could be relevant. Annie's actions were preceded by proactive conduct from birth, including the verbal abuse and revelation of infidelity. The cumulative provocations could amount to a qualifying trigger, particularly under the Section 55(4), which considers an action of an extremely grave character that give the defendant a justifiable sense of being seriously wronged. However, the timing of Annie's response, occurring after a walk to cool off, raises the question about whether she acted immediately or had regained a self control. Alternatively, the diminished responsibility under Section 2 of the Homicide Act 1957 as amended could be considered if Annie's mental state at the time was substantially impaired due to a recognized condition. Although there is no evidence to suggest this in the scenario regarding Anne's departure after Bert fell, her failure to call for help raises ethical questions but does not constitute a legal obligation to act unless a specific duty to act exists under R versus Stone and Robinson case in 1977. The third one is the objective test. The section 54(1)(c) requires that a person of any sex and age with a normal degree of tolerance and self-restraint might have reacted similarly in the circumstances. Factors such as Annie's cumulative provocation and Barrett's aggressive behavior supported her case. However, the personal characteristics, such as her history of being mocked or excluded from these assessments, as in the case of R versus Ashmelash case in 2013, whether Annie's reaction of throwing a bottle satisfied this test may depend on the jury's interpretation of what constitutes a reasonable response. Let's conclude. Annie is likely liable for murder due to her deliberate act of throwing the wine bottle, which caused Bert's fall and subsequent death. Her intention to cause at least grievous bodily harm is evident from her actions and statements. However, she may succeed in reducing her liability to manslaughter by arguing loss of control under Section 54 and Section 55 of CJA 2009. Bird's infidelity and belittling remarks provides a strong basis for a qualifying trigger, particularly when considered cumulatively under Clinton. The outcome will ultimately hinge on whether the jury find her reaction to be proportionate and reasonable under the circumstances. Thank you.